If you have ever watched one of my videos or just looked at an incredible painting like something by John Singer Sargent, and you have thought to yourself, that brushwork is gorgeous, but at the end of the day, don't those expressive brushstrokes just come from instinct and something that can't really be taught? If you have had that thought, today's video is for you, because I'm going to be breaking down my favorite painting from this year's Portrait Society of America Conference and International Competition. It is also the Draper Grand Prize winning portrait in this competition this year. It is called Yellow Trainers, and it is by the incredible Frances Bell. So I want to take a look and dissect some of my favorite aspects of this painting and just show you, the viewer, exactly what this piece has to teach us about expressive brushwork and how it's not just something arbitrary that's coming from instinct. It actually does have a rhyme and a reason. And once you can decode the secret pattern to it, well, you can start to put some of that really inspiring brushwork into your own artwork. I'll also be taking a look at some of my favorite John Singer Sargent paintings and show you how this isn't just like a one-off that we see just in Frances's work. This is something that we see is really carefully considered in these amazing painters who have that incredible balance in their work between realism and a painterly expressive quality in their mark making. I can't wait to dive in, and if you enjoy this video as I'm going further into it and you would like to dive deeper with me, I have an entire mini masterclass where I break down this thought process and more and show you exactly how you can apply this to your own studio practice. So if breaking free and loosening up is something you are really excited to do for your own oil painting or your own portraits, make sure that you register for that masterclass below. All right, let's dive in. So first things first, here on screen, I have this image of Frances's gorgeous painting. I felt so fortunate to take a look at this piece in person. I think right away, this piece is so striking because of its composition. And this is one of those things that painters regularly say, either it just can't be taught, or they have read one of those oil painting composition books and memorized all the rules and come away feeling really paralyzed. Like somehow you're going to break some obscure rule of composition, and even if you might enjoy the painting, someone's going to come along and tell you this is garbage. I'm here to tell you, if you feel that way, you are not alone in this. And I'm also going to demystify this a little bit because there's a lot of connection between your brushwork and your edges and how the painting is composed. And we really see this front and center in Frances's painting. First things first, she intentionally is playing with this black and white motif. We see it in the stripes of the wallpaper, we see it in the patterning of the floor, and of course we see it in all of her clothing except these yellow trainers or yellow sneakers that she's wearing. And what is so interesting about this to me is that it creates such an opportunity for variety in her brushwork. So we have places where the edges of things like her pants are getting lost in the stripes of the wallpaper or the dark tiles of the floor. We have places where the same thing is happening between her hair and the background or the vest that she's wearing in that background. I think it's really the way in which she's playing with edges that strikes me. So before I dissect what these edges look like and how they're actually working and why they're not just arbitrary, I want to dive in just by sharing a little bit of backstory. So while I was at the Portrait Society conference just a couple of weeks ago, I had this lovely gentleman, William, walk up to me and tell me that he's watched my YouTube videos for a long time, and he was curious in all of my years of studying artists like Sargent and applying what I could take from his work to my own and putting that content on YouTube, how had I seen my work evolve? He was a little bit skeptical that I could really take Sargent's brushwork and put it into what I was doing. Because after all, at the end of the day, isn't some of Sargent's brushwork just coming from instinct? Isn't some of it just a little bit arbitrary? And aren't those the kinds of things that make our unique voice? I loved this question. It's part of the reason why I love something like the Portrait Society conference, because I get to go so in depth and have conversations with all of you who watch my videos in a way that I simply don't get to do when we're just online. So I really appreciated him, coming forward and asking me this question. And it comes from such a genuine place. And I know that there are so many painters who are wondering the same thing. So I'm really happy to be dissecting this for you. What I explained to him is that this is a completely understandable conclusion, but as soon as you start dissecting things like Sargent's paintings, you begin to realize that there is actually a rhyme and reason to a lot of the edges that we see in those paintings, a lot of the brush strokes that we see in those paintings. For the sake of this video, I'm probably going to use edges and brushwork somewhat synonymously. Basically, it just refers to the way the mark looks when going down. Is this a brush mark that becomes totally invisible and you can't see evidence of the brush afterward? Or can you see the entirety of that brush mark? Does it leave a really hard edge between that mark and the mark surrounding it? Or is the edge somewhat softened? Or is the edge completely invisible and one brush mark seems to just melt into the adjacent brush marks? So that's why I'm going to use these terms a little bit interchangeably, because talking about brushwork and the texture of that brushwork often goes hand in hand with talking about edges and how you control your edges in a piece. So to give you a quick example, if we look at this Sargent painting, El Jaleo, we see basically the full gamut of brush marks here. So we can look at something like this very diffuse shadow on the wall that's being cast by this dancer and realize that there are hundreds of tiny brush strokes in here, but it's actually really difficult to distinguish these brush strokes from one another, especially if we look at this little passage in here. A lot of places where I can tell all of this is the same color, but I couldn't really count how many brush strokes there are because it's really difficult to separate those strokes from one another. That would be an example of the edges of your brush strokes being so soft that they become lost in one another. Another way we could talk about lost edges comes when we're discussing edges between objects. So when we look at the shawl that this dancer is wearing, there are numerous places where we can only really infer where does the shawl end and where do the dark colors of the musician sitting against this wall begin. We can use some context clues. So for instance, if I look at this sleeve of the shawl here, I assume the edge between her shawl and this shadowy area of this other part of the shawl happens right about here. And I can also imagine that the edge between her shawl and the background musicians happens somewhere around here. But at the end of the day, it's not completely obvious. I'm having to make an inference. Now, by comparison, we can look at a very hard edge where the white of her skirt is butting up against the dark of the musicians against this wall and the shadow shapes that is engulfing them. And then there are, of course, some kinds of brush marks in between, like this softened edge describing where the shoulder of this musician is meeting with the light wall color of the background. But at the same time, it's not completely crisp. And so when we study something like Sargent's work, one thing that we start to notice is that there is a bit of a predictability about where these different kinds of edges and brush marks are really happening. So first things first, I want to give credit where credit is due and say a lot of this I learned from Richard Schmid's incredible book, Alla Prima 2. He has an entire chapter on edges, and he did such a beautiful job of distilling down all of the factors that in his experience will determine whether the edge between various objects or various brush strokes should be hard, soft, or lost. So let's go ahead and quickly recap some of those ideas, because I see this in Sargent's work. I see this, of course, in Richard Schmid's paintings. I see this in my own paintings. And when we go back to Frances Bell's portrait, we're going to see it in her painting as well. The first thing that we can talk about is very simply, how high is the contrast between adjacent shapes? So when we look at this skirt up against the background, in general, these edges are tending to be a little bit on the harder side, and that is because we are comparing a very, very light value set of brushstrokes to very dark value brushstrokes. So areas where that contrast is high, we tend to err on the side of harder edges. The opposite is also true. So areas where the contrast is minimal, we tend to see softened or completely lost edges. Nothing shows this better than this giant mass of shadow shapes between the various musicians, the shadows they are engulfed in, and the shadows that they are casting. I cannot, for instance, really make out the distinction between any of these musicians here on the left, but I know that they are all their own separate shapes. But when it comes to just dissecting the brushwork and the mark making, all of these edges are lost because the value is all functionally the same. And we can see a middle ground here where in her skirt, the local color of the skirt is a white or an off-white, but as it goes into shadow and the value becomes darker, it becomes closer in value to this background shadow shape, and we start to see some areas where the edges get softer compared to what we see where it's this crisp, bright white of the skirt against the very dark background. So value is one way that we can create that contrast. Color is another. So if we had a bright red object up against a bright green object, chances are, just because those colors are complements, and especially if those colors are both very high chroma, so it's like neon green versus neon red, chances are we're much more likely to have a hard edge between those two objects. But it's not just the color or the lightness or darkness of two objects that determine their edge relationship or can help guide that edge relationship. Some other things that we can consider are the nature of the material. You will notice that something like the frayed end of her shawl has naturally kind of softer edges and softer brushwork than this very shiny highlight in this guitar. So I'm going to quickly zoom in just to show you. While we do have some crisp edges, a lot of the edges in the fraying ends of the shawl are softened, and that is to suggest the fraying nature of the material. Versus if we're looking at a very shiny material or metallic material, it is much more likely, just like this little tiny accent highlight on this guitar, that you're gonna have a very, very crisp edge. And we can see this echoed in the shiny, almost metallic accents in this shawl. We don't really see a lot of softened brushstrokes here. The edges between the green brushstrokes and the nearly black brushstrokes are very, very crisply defined. All right, so here's some other things that can be predictors of an edge softening. Textures like hair will often be depicted as a softer material. Fur will often be depicted as a softer edge. An object that is gently sloping back into space, like something that is spherical or conical or cylindrical, kind of like what we can think about for the slope of this man's shoulder going back into space, typically we will depict with a softer edge as opposed to something like a cube, something with like very crisp, very sharply turning edges, like maybe the edges of this guitar. Much more crisp than the softer edge of the shoulder. And then finally, one other indicator that we should be considering softening an edge would be whether that object is in motion or maybe just completed motion, or could burst into motion. This one is a tricky one. Of course, in El Jaleo, we were talking about a dancer, and so there are some parts of her that are moving. I see this most notably in this one hand that is whipping her skirt around. When I think about this kind of flamenco pose that she is holding, it's easy for me to imagine that this hand is probably relatively static, whereas this hand is actually whipping the skirt through the air. And sure enough, when I take a look at these borders of her fingers, these fingers feel like they're painted with softer edges than maybe these fingers appear. Another really common place where we can see this is in portraiture, typically in the lips. So I have this other Sargent painting pulled up, and I think this actually reinforces a lot of what we've been talking about. So we see softened edges in her hair because there is that kind of curly, soft hair texture. I can't even quite make out what this part of her garment is made of, but it would be easy for me to imagine it being something very soft, maybe like a delicate lace, or maybe even like some kind of fur texture. But we do very much see that kind of echoed in the relative softness of some of the brush strokes. If we go into the jewelry, something very reflective, like the pearls of these accents on her dress, or we just look at the sheen of the dress itself, these edges of the brush marks are actually like quite hard in a lot of places. And it reflects that there's this satiny sheen both to the material of the dress, and that these pearls and various jewels that are adorning the dress are in fact very shiny. But a place that a lot of painters get really tripped up with this is the lips of a portrait. Because if you think about the human face, especially if you're watching this video right now, you might notice my lips are the part of my face that is moving the most. My eyes might be moving the second most, my nose a little bit less than that, and probably my ears less than that. Even though in this Sargent portrait, the model probably wasn't talking as she posed for this. Her lips are the most mobile part of her face. And if you want to capture a lifelike feeling, or the idea that like this person could just kind of spring to life and start talking to you, it is helpful to have very softened edges around the lips. And this might feel kind of familiar if you've ever painted a portrait and found that it looks like you have just really laid on the lip liner onto your subject, especially if you are painting someone who is male. Very easy to get this effect where it looks like there's lipstick, even if the lips aren't particularly red or pink, all because the edges around the lips are too hard. And that is because as humans, there's this little kind of bias in our perception when we look at somebody where we perceive the lips as being movable, even if their mouth happens to be relatively still. And so in order to paint something in a way that feels lifelike, we want our brushwork to reflect that. And typically that means really softening up some of these edges of the lips that it would be tempting to really zero in on and make much higher contrast. Let's go ahead and apply this back to Frances's incredible portrait here. So what I noticed right off the bat is not only is she paying attention to these opportunities to make her edges softer or lose them or make the edges harder, but she's doing this, she's designing the image in a way where there's going to be this really pleasing rhythm of those edge relationships. And this is something that I really admire in so many of her paintings. So let's first talk about the ways in which she's upholding these sort of edge relationships that I've just described to you in general guidelines, and then I want to go back to this idea of a rhythm of edges. First things first, in this particular piece, there's a couple of just little pops of contrast that my eye is really drawn to. And one of them is this one little mark that is in the cuff of her sleeve. It is this shadow that's being cast onto her skin underneath the hem of this cuff. You'll notice she keeps this edge very sharp, and rightly so, because it's an area where we're going from a very light value to a very dark one. And not only that, but that cuff is very steeply turning a corner back into space, whereas something like her knee or her leg is more gently curving around. So it kind of invites this softer edge, whereas this is turning back so steeply that the edge should remain very crisp to be convincing. Similarly, we see her paying attention to what the edge relationship should be when we take a look at the shinier objects in this painting. Something like her watch, the buttons on this vest, or this one beautiful accent on her glasses, or even the highlights in her eyes. All of these surfaces have a very shiny, glossy finish, whether we're talking about the metal of the watch, the glossy plastic of a button, we're talking about the glass lens of an eyeglass, or we're talking about the kind of watery sheen that we get on our eyes when there are highlights there. And so not only is there a lot of contrast in these areas to really support these hardened edges, but these edges are doing a lot of heavy lifting to convey what these materials really are and what the texture is like. And then by contrast, if we look at something like the beautiful sheen of her blouse, yes, there are some opportunities where it has that satiny sheen, and because it's more reflective, we paint it with a harder edge, like where the sleeve turns from light into shadow here. But that's not happening throughout, and it's certainly not a shinier material than the silver of the watch or the bright shiny button. And we see this really reflected in those edge relationships. She's not letting these edges compete with these smaller accents that we've been talking about. But putting this all together, one thing that I notice when I take a look at Frances's paintings is she does such a beautiful job of never having too many lost edges in a row, or hard edges in a row, or soft edges in a row. There's this beautiful kind of rhythm, or like musicality almost, to the way that she is presenting these edges to you in an order. And she's doing it in a way that's so beautifully depicting the nature of the material and how movable that material might be, but she's paying attention to things like her value relationships and her color relationships, and all of these things are arranged in a way where it is pleasing to the eye and it moves your eye through the painting in a way that it keeps you really engaged and keeps you interested. So for instance, if we take a look at, let's just pick a random place to start on this painting. So I'm going to take a look at this shirt sleeve on the right. We start with what I'm going to call a pretty hard edge here. And that makes sense because the shirt sleeve is pretty light. It is set up against this dark stripe. And then we go into this long passage of having a soft edge because, again, we still have this contrast, but maybe the contrast is a little bit less bright than it was down here. We have this little moment of a lost edge where the value of the shirt sleeve is effectively the same value as the light wallpaper stripe behind her. And then we start to see a little bit of this cast shadow, and we see the edge and the value relationship change a little bit. And we go back into this hard edge, a little pop of a lost edge, a softened edge, back into a lost edge between the vest and this darkened stripe, into a soft edge of the vest versus the lighter stripe, a little accent of hard edge right here in the shadow. We go back into a softened edge where the value of the neck is fairly close to the value of the stripe that it's sitting up against, but the colors are somewhat different. And we have the neck curving back into space as a cylinder. So we want to suggest some roundness there. Then we get the crisp edge, the hard edge of the jawline next to the dark of her hair. And this pattern essentially repeats throughout the painting, where it's never just this gradient of like hard into soft into lost. We will have places where a hard edge is against a soft edge for like a lot of visual interest. And it's done in this way that never gets your eye like stuck in one place. And it means that she is allowing herself the latitude to create things like this beautiful dark accent mark in this stripe behind her, where this stripe on the wall, on the wallpaper, is very clearly all the same color. But because she's keeping her values really close and to create a little bit of visual interest, she's letting this just be like one kind of chunky, hard-edged mark. It's gorgeous. Similarly, I love, as I look at this crease between the inner part of this left shirt sleeve and this vest, how we go from hard edge to soft edge the edge kind of re-hardens here and gets really crisp, it is so soft next to it that you can't even tell where the shirt sleeve ends and the vest begins. We go back into this beautiful crisp hard edge where the brushstroke just looks so juicy and elegant. It never looks too hard. It never looks too vague. The texture of the brushwork is just so genuinely interesting, and the more opportunities I have to get to study incredible paintings like this one by amazing artists, the more I realize that all of these brushstrokes are very well thought out. It's not arbitrary. And artists might get to the place where these things happen by instinct because they've been honing their craft over so many years, but you can absolutely go back and analyze them and realize that even if they're at the point where it might come instinctively, there is actually a method to the madness. There is, a pattern that you can discern and then apply to your own work. I could probably talk about this painting all day, but I want to make sure that I keep this video actionable, and I hope that you enjoyed looking at this gorgeous piece of art as much as I always enjoy getting to look at it. But if this kind of analysis is really fascinating to you and it hits close to home because you want to loosen up your brushwork, and if you would like my help reverse engineering that process and learning how to take incredible paintings like these and understand that the loose brushwork isn't arbitrary. It's something that you can study and improve the same way that you can improve your ability to capture a likeness or mix accurate color. I have a free webinar that I will link down in the description that walks you through the start to finish process of how I use these kinds of analyses to help myself and other painters just like you to apply this to your own goal style of artwork. So if your goal is to loosen up, but you don't just want to rely on instinct, check out that webinar below because it'll walk you through the whole process, no gaps of exactly what you need to implement in your studio practice. I look forward to seeing you in the webinar, and until next week, happy painting.